Okay, so GDP and component analysis under the knowledge series session. Let's first understand why are macroeconomic indicators so important. So we have a whole host of macro indicators such as GDP, inflation, interest rates, employment data, fiscal deficit, monetary deficit, monetary policy, fiscal policy, trade deficit data, current account deficit data, balance of payments, which essentially become extremely important, and they're also kind of tracked day to day, reported a lot by the media. So why are they so important? First point, they are essential to ascertaining the economic environment of a country. More importantly, there are two other reasons why macroeconomic data and an understanding of macroeconomics in a detailed manner is necessary for anyone who's planning to build a career in finance. And that's one, because today we have a scenario where the world is not really open too much, barring some of the developed nations. Most of the other countries kind of allow investments within their region. So for example, India allows investment primarily in Indian asset classes. If you do want to invest outside India, there are some limits around it. So it's not absolutely easy and simple if you want to go and let's say buy real estate in a location like Brazil. So today it's a little bit closed, but tomorrow it may not be. Tomorrow it might open up. It might kind of allow you to kind of go and invest anywhere in the world. Now, if you have to invest in, let's say, a Russian company, and you want to find out exactly, how the company is working, that's absolutely, next to impossible to really do any kind of analysis on a company-to-company basis, or for that matter, even on a sector-to-sector basis in a geography. What you can do, however, is try and correlate about, the macroeconomic indicators that economy has, and try and compare it to a similar economy. So let's say we want to kind of compare Russia. So it helps us understand an unfamiliar economy. We can kind of check these indicators in, let's say, a country like India and compare them to Russia, or let's say compare Russia to China, and try and figure out exactly what is happening in these countries. Now, why is that important is because it kind of tells us in a sense of lead information that this might be happening in the country, or this might be the theme that might play out next few years in the country. So for example, a lot of the analysts are saying that African countries are going to see a demographic boom just like what India and China have seen in the last few years. So essentially, if that is going to follow, then investment opportunities in African countries can be compared as compared to an India or a China, depending on what kind of macroeconomic parameters match. And then you could kind of extrapolate and say, okay, this country is this, that country is that, and which one is a better one to invest. That's one of the primary sources or reasons why macro indicators become important for anyone who wants to build a career in finance. Second, in general, media around us throws a lot of data points, so we don't really know which one is correct, which one is not correct. So to be able to adjudge government policies and make sense about decent investment opportunities in a country, it is absolutely necessary that we have a fair degree of hold over what is being projected and what is being communicated. How is it being calculated? Why is it being calculated? And can there be something wrong about the data? We'll touch upon one of these points today, which is essentially GDP and individual components of GDP, and try and look at some interesting data points around that. Before that, generally, whenever you want any kind of data on the economic segment, typically the best location to get it is the central bank of the country. So effectively, if you want any data related to India, the best place to go and find this data is essentially the RBI website. Now, RBI website may not really give you the data in the best possible format, but it does give you a fair amount of data. You have loads and loads of data available on the RBI website. If you do want to use it and do some sort of an analysis with that data, it's a different issue that most of that is, for example, given in the form of a PDF file, which might not be really easy to kind of use. Plus, definitions may not be easily available at all points of time. So that's essentially what is the best place to get data. There are other websites as well. So for example, in India, you could look at Finance Ministry's website, which kind of typically any country's finance ministry would give a decent amount of data. You could have global data sources such as IMF, OECD, World Bank kind of website. So if you go to the World Bank website, what you'll find is something like this. So they have debt statistics, they have data in terms of countries, they have data in terms of indicators essentially. So you'll know all this portion that you can go and search on the website, and you can get direct rankings. Wikipedia actually gives a lot of rankings in the first place directly, correct? So that's broadly the component in terms of where do I get the data. Let's move back to our analysis point, which is essentially GDP. Fine. So before we kind of go ahead, we keep hearing this data point that India's GDP growth rate has kind of fallen from something like 8% to 5%. I have a small question for all of us here, which is essentially this 5% GDP growth rate, which you will now see on your screen. This GDP growth rate of around 5% in India, is it our real GDP growth rate or our nominal GDP growth rate? So if you can answer it, you can select it there itself. So is this our real GDP growth rate or our nominal GDP growth rate? I think I have most of the answers. I'll just share those with you. Nearly 80% of us believe that it is our nominal GDP growth rate, which is at 5%. So the first thing that beckons essentially is to figure out what is real and what is nominal, and what is the context of understanding real and nominal, and how does that play out, correct? So let's try and quickly understand these as we go along between real and nominal numbers. So the first point that comes in is some sort of standard parameters, which is volume, price, and value. Volume indicates how much of something you are selling. Price is the prevalent price today. Volume multiplied by the price is going to give you the value of something sold. So for example, certain tons of steel that you have produced, certain price of each ton of steel, and multiply to get the value. Nominal data is essentially data that is expressed in terms of current prices, which means you just take today's value, and give that out. So today's volume, today's price, multiply, get the value. That's nominal data, correct? Real data is expressed in terms of prices of a base year. So you basically go back a few years and fix the prices there, and hence you remove the inflation impact every year. So you basically just remove the inflation impact and then try and find out what exactly is the growth rate. Now, why do you do that? What is the whole joy in kind of creating two kind of numbers? So let's understand that a little bit better as we kind of look at this particular table. Now, when you look at this table, you will see a few data points on this. So the first one is essentially the year that we are talking about. So we are taking a hypothetical country and we are looking at years between 2000 and 2005. We are looking at some volume of something that this country is producing. Let's assume, argument's sake, they're producing steel, 100 tons of steel. Hypothetical price of steel is 25, whatever unit you want to consider. I'm not sure what the exact price of that is, but that's beyond the discussion. We have a price, we have a volume, so I can multiply the two to get the nominal output of the country. This is the output of the country, assuming this is the only thing that the country is doing. So what we have is 100 tons of steel at a price of 25, giving me 2500, 103 tons of steel at a price of 26, which gives me 2678, so on and so forth. So column 2 and column 3 get multiplied to give me column 4. Correct? Column 4 is what is known as nominal growth, because it is in current nominal values, because this is in current price terms. Ignore column 5 for a second, go to column 6. That's the growth rate. So from 2500 to 2678, from 2678 to 2940, etc. This is basically what we are looking at in terms of the growth numbers. Consider the case of 2 years, 2002 and 2003. From 2002 to 2003, you find that the growth rate in 2003 is 13.2%. So the GDP or output of this country has grown by 13.2%, which is a fairly good number. However, when you look at the actual volume of things produced, you find that that number has actually fallen. Now this kind of confuses us, because in terms of actual output, production, volume, the country is worse off. They're producing less than what they were producing till last year. But in terms of value, they are growing at 13%. Now this 13% growth, as we now would have figured out, is coming primarily because of this price increase. But this is misleading, because price increase could basically reverse the next year. Price increase is considered temporary in nature. So effectively, I need a mechanism to be able to remove this price increase from the equation. I somehow need to remove it. Look at next year, for example, your output increases in volume terms, your price decreases, which results in a negative nominal growth. correct? Because when you multiply the two, you find there is a degrowth that is happening from 2003 to 2004. But the problem is not, it's a misleading data. It is not clearly showing that on a per capita basis, you are better off in 2004 as compared to 2003. You're producing more. And the actual prosperity of a country has to be determined by how much more are they producing, regardless of what the price is. Price is a temporary phenomenon, and that has to be excluded from the analysis, which is where real analysis becomes important. Now comes in the real number. Now, how do you calculate the real number? So when you look at the real number, the simplest way of calculating the real number is just remove the price from the equation. Just find out growth from here to here. So 100 to 103 is a 3% growth rate that you see here on the screen. So the last column, which is column 7, basically gives you output growth. Now it's easy to do if there is one product that is being produced. It's not so easy to do if there are multiple products that are being produced. So in that context, what becomes necessary is you take a base year. Let's assume we take the base year as 2000 in our analysis, and we fix the price at 2000 levels. So we fix the price at 25. Now we multiply the output of each year with 25. So we have fixed the prices at 25 and we are multiplying the output of each year with 25 to get column 5. Now if we find the difference of these two numbers and the growth rate over these two numbers, this is effectively the growth rate mathematically of this number, which is your real GDP growth rate. So that's your real GDP growth rate. That's because it gives you a real understanding of whether the country is doing well or not. So as you would see, between 2002 and 2003, the number is actually negative because output declined. Between 2003 and 2004, the number is positive because output was higher. So logically, at all points of time, the data that is being given to you has to speak about real GDP growth. Nominal GDP growth is a number that doesn't really give you correct information. It gives you information, but it could be misleading in a lot of the cases. So first learning, what we see as 5% is not our nominal growth rate, but our real GDP growth rate, correct? Typically now, how do you find nominal growth rate? So the exact equation, if you have to find out one, to find out from here, you can solve this mathematically. I'll not get into details of that, but effectively 1 plus real growth multiplied by 1 plus inflation should give you 1 plus nominal growth. You can try and solve for any of these two numbers. You have nominal growth given, you have real growth given. You can calculate the inflation. That will be the difference between these two price points effectively. So that's how you effectively calculate real from nominal and vice versa. In reality, what we are trying to do is basically we are just, to kind of simplify things, because this equation, usually your real number and inflation number are going to be in the region of 7-8% or so maximum in general. Usually your equation simplifies itself to real growth plus inflation is going to be ballpark equal to the nominal growth rate approximately. So our real growth rate, let's say, is 6%. Our inflation is, let's say, 6%. Nominal growth rate of GDP in India should be around 12%. In fact, in the last many years, we have been averaging a nominal GDP growth rate of 14 to 16%. That's because we were growing at 8%. That was real growth. And our inflation was close to around 8% as well. So effectively, you add these two, you get an approximate estimate. I'll quickly repeat. When you have to calculate real GDP growth rate, what you are taking is you are taking a base year price. So effectively, whatever is the output of that particular year, you multiply it with the base year price. So when you compare between 2 years, all you are comparing is the output. You're not really getting the price into the equation because the price cancels each other out, correct? So if you multiply 100 with 25 and you multiply 103 with 25, you can practically cancel 25 on the numerator and denominator and directly compare 103 to 100, correct? So effectively, all you are trying to do is find out the actual output growth of the country. That's real growth. Only about 20% of us were correct. The GDP number that is revealed in the media is real GDP growth rate for India. Nominal is much higher. If we were growing nominal terms at 5%, if we were growing in nominal terms at 5%, then assuming an inflation of 7 to 8%, so nominal minus inflation would have given us the real. If we were growing at minus 2%, there would have been significant unrest in the country. Minus 2% is not a good number to grow at, correct? So that's about real and nominal data. Important parameters because that is relevant to our overall understanding. Let's go ahead. What is GDP and what is GNP? Now, GDP is the sum total of all economic activity within a country. It includes economic activity by a foreign firm in the country. Correct? So whatever PepsiCo earns in India actually is a part of GDP of India. There's another term called GNP, which is gross national product. It's the total of incomes earned by a country's residents regardless of where they stay or work. That's also known as gross national income. Now that's not too important because an Indian staying in the US, whatever he earns is a part of gross national product. But in terms of analysis, it doesn't give you an idea about investment opportunities in India. So practically at all points of time, we find a mention of GDP and not really of GNP. Now, how do you calculate this GDP? So we just saw one method, which was basically find the output of the country. There are three ways practically that you can find out what is the GDP of a country. You can measure the entire final output of the country. You can measure the entire final consumption in the country. You can measure the cumulative income of every person in the country. Correct? So you can do these three things. Let's try and understand a bit of this as we go along. Now, whichever method you use, you will eventually come up with the same number. Let's take a simple example. Let's assume there is a simple country that has an orange farmer. There is a orange juice maker. And there is one consumer. Just three players in the economy, just this economic activity. The farmer, farms some oranges and sells it for, let's say, $10 to the orange juice maker. The orange juice maker makes glasses of juice out of it, which is essentially sold to the consumer for $15. It could be 100 consumers here, but effectively that's the broad sense of what is happening. If I want to find out what is the final output of the country, final output of the country is glasses of orange juice. That's worth $15. If I want to find out, remember oranges which were sold here from the orange farmer to the orange juice maker was intermediate output. This is an intermediate stage. It's not a final stage. The final product comes here. So that's the final stage. Correct? If I measure the final consumption of the country, what is the final consumption? Consumption is again the same glasses of juice, which is going to be $15. If I look at cumulative income of everyone in the country, the orange farmer earned $10. The juice maker earned 15 minus 10. That's $5. Correct? Because he paid 10 and he earned this thing. So 10 plus 5 is going to give you 15. That's the cumulative income of every person in the country. Now it's simple to kind of calculate it for such a simple country. This is an ideal word, but in reality you don't have data collection mechanisms, plus you have hundreds of thousands of products and services which are actually being sold in the first place. So to be able to actually capture the final output of the country or final consumption of the country or cumulative income of every person in the country becomes extremely difficult in the first place. So that unfortunately or fortunately, we have to live with. And hence you find multiple estimates of GDP coming out. You get one estimate, then you get another estimate, then you get a provisional number, and then you have a revision of that number. So every country, when they reveal a GDP number, basically it kind of gets revised 3 or 4 times. Now, it's difficult to capture final output of everything in the country. So typically surveys are taken and then weights are assigned to various industries. So weights are assigned to industries. You take surveys from various industries and then you approximate the GDP number. Remember, we don't have a foolproof mechanism of arriving at an exact GDP number because it's extremely difficult to capture it in the first place. Correct? Now, within these three methods, the most intuitive way to look at it is something called as the consumption method, which is the final consumption, also known as the expenditure method, because this consumer is spending something to buy this. So whoever spends anything is going to look at become part of consumption. It's easier to capture because usually this is the transaction that is getting recorded. So the final consumption typically is captured to a large extent, and hence this is the most intuitive way that is used. Now there are four parts to this, and effectively there are four parts to it. So you have to essentially look at what kind of numbers come in these four parts. So let's look at these four one by one. One is government expenditure. So either the government can spend money. The second is private expenditure, which is we can spend money. The third is investments, which is corporates can go and invest in future capacity building. And the fourth is net exports, which is exports minus imports. Everything that a country does falls in these four brackets. Anyone doing anything in the country will fall in one or the other of these brackets. There is no double counting. So anything that is counted twice is removed or adjusted. Fine. So we'll see how that gets done, but let's quickly go ahead. I have a small question in between, which is, does inflation play a role in calculation of GDP? Of course it does. That's why we calculated nominal and real. And what is more important is we calculate the real GDP, which the government does for us, where they don't take into consideration what is the price today. They just multiply the output today with the price at some other point of time. India uses a base year of 2004-05. So prices are fixed at 2004-05 levels, and you calculate real GDP based on those numbers. Let's quickly look at what comes in GDP. All goods and services included in GDP should be produced in the measurement period. The only goods and services included are those whose value can be determined by being sold in the market. So if I am gardening in my garden, that's not included. It might be effort, it might create something in terms of effort or output, but essentially it is not a part of GDP because it can't be sold in the market. There are some services which are not sold in the market, but they are included in the GDP. For example, salaries to government employees. These are not sold in the market, but at cost they are imputed and put in terms of government expenditure in terms of the GDP number. Changes to inventory are a part of the GDP. So effectively, if the inventory has changed because the good has already been produced, it is considered as a part of the GDP. Effectively, the equation boils down to something like this: GDP being represented by Y. So Y is equal to government spending plus consumer spending plus investments, which includes gross private domestic investment, including business investment and changes in inventory. Remember, if you're using the consumption method, this C will not capture what is in inventory. So if the country produced 100, but people bought only 90, this equation will only account for 90. So you have to make that adjustment in I, where changes in inventory are added. That 10 will get added here. Then you have exports minus imports. Now one question could be, why are we actually subtracting imports? Technically we are buying something from outside. So why are we really subtracting imports from this equation? See, exports is simple because we have produced it, and this is something that is not consumed in India but consumed elsewhere. So essentially that's a part of our GDP because it's been produced and it's been sold, and it has not been captured in internal consumption. It has to be captured in terms of exports. But imports is in a sense captured here. Let's say I import something worth $100. So I imported something worth $100. So that's my import bill. There was some value addition on this item and it got sold in India for $150. So my consumption, my C in the equation, will capture $150. But remember that out of this 150, the value added in India was only 50. 100 was actually imported. So you have to subtract 100 from this, and hence you see a minus imports number in this equation. Imports has to be subtracted because the value of the imported good, while is already counted in the consumption, to the extent that it is not produced in the country, you have to remove it. So if we had not done any value addition, import bill was 100 and we had sold the good at 100 in India straight away, there is no production. This is not product of India. This is not gross domestic product of India. So you have to exclude this number. So this 100 gets added in C and this 100 gets subtracted from M. So the equation eventually would say 0. That's the equation. Now this is a simple equation, but this is an extremely powerful equation because this one simple equation is going to help us judge exactly what the government says and what is the situation at this point of time in India. Just to give a very simple example, if you look at the time around the 2008 crisis, you had a scenario where global trade went down. So if global trade went down, then you will have X minus M going down in general, typically because exports fall down, all kind of discretionary exports fall. If you are a country like India, which is importing oil, oil import doesn't fall that dramatically, correct? So X minus M number goes down. You have a scenario where consumer spending will go down because people are not sure of their jobs. So C goes down. Because consumer spending has gone down, effectively business climate would have worsened. So further investment spending will also go down. Companies will not invest to create more business because they're not sure what is going to happen in 2009. Now, in this kind of a scenario where three of these components are falling, the only way your GDP can continue to grow, if you want it to grow, is if the government spending increases. And that's why you heard bailout package after bailout package at that point of time. Effectively, every country came out with a bailout package. Those who didn't, like your Greece and Austria and Ireland varieties, effectively saw GDP falling. Correct? A simple equation will help us understand a few things. So we have taken nominal and real GDP. Per capita GDP is total GDP divided by the population. Now, effectively, when we look at per capita GDP number, the problem with per capita GDP essentially is that you may not get a correct estimate. So let's understand that how. Let's go ahead and I'll come to the last part in a moment. These are the rankings, slightly older data, I think 2012 data, based on nominal GDP, absolute product of each country in US dollar trillions. Where do we stand? So effectively, India is somewhere at the 11th number. You have United States, which is the largest country, logical and known to everyone. China is the second largest one, Japan the third largest one. India is at $1.7 trillion of output. Now, why is this significant? Is because it helps you gauge news items. In 2012, there was a lot of news floating around about all these European economies not doing too well. So, Portugal was not doing well, Greece was not doing well. Portugal and Greece are not very big. But then there was news that Italy is not doing well, Spain is not doing well. Look at where Spain is. Spain is almost the size of India. Look at where Italy is. Italy is bigger than India in terms of absolute GDP. Now, if one of these countries goes and defaults in the international markets, this could create big problems in financial services segment as such. So that is important news. And we just need to have a pecking order to understand which of these countries are big in terms of an understanding. Now, simply put, your per capita GDP number is a simple calculation. $1.7 trillion would be somewhere around $1,700 billion. That's our GDP. Divided by our population, that's about 1.2 billion. Sorry, not dollar. So effectively, you get a number of close to about $1,400 per person, correct? Ballpark, you get data about $1,400 per person. And that should be the per capita GDP of a person in India. Now, this is a slightly misleading number because $1,400 in the hands of an Indian would be different from $1,400 in the hands of a US guy because of our standards of living and the general prices around us, correct? So for argument's sake, it's quite possible that one packet of bread might cost $1 in the US, but it costs 30 bucks in India, which is about half a dollar. So if you have $1 and you're just buying bread, your living standard is twice as good as that in the US guy, in the US essentially. So effectively, you have to adjust this in terms of what is the power of this currency. So $1,400 in India is equivalent to what exact number? This adjustment is something called as purchasing power parity. So what you do is whatever is this absolute number, you try and convert it in terms of what is the exact power of this particular currency and how much can you purchase of it. That adjustment will typically tell you that a country like India will have a slightly better number as compared to what it is evident here. So let's look at purchasing power parity based off, GDP per capita numbers. These are based on purchasing power parity adjustments, where we see India is 3694. Remember, it is not 1400, which we just mathematically calculated. Now, what does this simply put mean? Very simply put, this means that roughly about $1,400 in the hands of an Indian are equivalent to about $3,700 in the hands of a US guy. That's the equivalence of this data point. That's what this means. At this number, we are around 132nd in the world. Not a great scenario to be in, but improving year on year. China is around 95. Even though India and China put together are significantly large chunks of the global economy, on a per capita adjusted basis, the standard of living is not that great, which is what per capita data tells you. This now, kind of in addition to the previous data point that we had, gives a clearer picture of, what is the standard of living in any country, correct? So you could again get this data of Wikipedia, per capita adjusted for purchasing power parity. As I said, India and China, this is picked up from FT. There was an article in the FT which said the gray bars here basically tell you about the share of India and China in the world GDP. So you see this number has been growing consistently quarter on quarter, and somewhere in 2011 we were around 13% of the world GDP. Now this number would be close to about 15% of the world GDP. But both the countries have been slowing down in terms of their GDP growth over the last few quarters, correct? So essentially that's what we'll try and decode as we go along. Now let's go back a little bit to this equation and understand how the data is revealed by the RBI. Now in this context, government spending is given as government spending, consumer spending is given as consumer spending. This investment number is given in the form of something known as gross fixed capital formation. Why gross fixed capital formation? Because typically your investments would result in capital formation or capex, which is what really drives further growth in any economy. So out of these four components in GDP, ideally what should happen is your I should be the driver, or this gross fixed capital formation should be the driver for subsequent subsequent numbers that subsequent growth that a country sees. Unless you have a good sustainable investment climate in a country, you will find that sooner or later GDP growth will suffer. The government can't keep spending as much as they like to. They can't keep spending out of their means, correct? So let's look at the breakup. What we see here in terms of the three lines is the blue line is the government spending, the red line is the private expenditure, the green line is gross fixed capital formation. Now there are two important data points that become interesting here. So the first one is, look at the government spending number that you see here. That's your 2009 financial year, where everything else fell. The government had to kind of put up a huge growth in their, this is growth numbers as compared to last year, huge growth in their spending in that year because of the bailout package to prop up GDP growth rate. Now, because government of India has consistently been spending a lot and spending a lot, there's a huge fiscal deficit, which means they are earning less than what they are spending. So they have slowed this down considerably. Government spending has slowed down. Consumer private expenditure, which is consumption essentially, used to be hovering around the ranges of 10% for a long, long while. But if you look around you and you look at anecdotal data in a country like India, car sales are falling, housing sales are kind of on the dip, housing inventory is rising in each of the locations, consumer durable sales are falling. So logically in the last few quarters, you see the red line dipping as well. Now what needs to drive your GDP is effectively the green line, which is gross fixed capital formation. This used to hover in the range of 15 to 20% for a long while. It dipped dramatically here, but that was just in reaction to what happened in 2008 and 9 essentially. So there was a dip, but it bounced back. Now over the last 3 years, this green line has started averaging between 0 and 5%. Now that's a dangerous signal, because technically speaking, today's capital expenditure is going to generate jobs tomorrow, and unless that improves, we don't really see how GDP growth will pick up dramatically, correct? So let's go ahead and look at more data. So that's gross fixed capital formation growth quarter on quarter. This number used to be consistently in the region of 15% all this while, fell down only in the 2009 crisis, and then again kind of went up only to come back down in 2012 financial year onwards. So effectively, companies are spending less in terms of their overall investments in capacity. Why are they doing so? Is because of two reasons. One, they could probably be sitting on a lot of capacity in the first place. Second, consumer demand is not high. We have seen in general media that consumer demand is not high because your auto sales data, etc., continues to fall in India. But what kind of capacity utilization are we talking about? In general, investment climate is not so good, so you don't find too many firms coming in investing in India right away because of the, a little bit of policy paralysis as well. Let's look at the correlation between something like the GDP growth and growth in gross fixed capital formation. So when you see gross fixed capital formation, which is the blue bar, growing at around 15 to 16%, you see GDP growth numbers of around 9% and higher. 2008 was lower. GDP growth was still higher because the government propped this up, but your blue bar was much lower. 9, 10, again, it kind of went up. 2011 financial year, again, fixed capital formation was high. Subsequently, you see fixed capital formation dwindling down dramatically. It's gone to a region of 0 to 2%, and your GDP growth is also going down. Now, that's interesting because this is a dangerous sign for an economy that is trying to grow, correct? So that's part one of the story. In our equation, we are saying that consumer spending is falling. We are saying that investment is falling. Can investment pick up immediately? Let's look at more data points. If investment we think can pick up immediately. Now, the third part of the equation that we find, which is why your X minus M imports subtracted from the exports, what is happening to this number? So that's our trade deficit number, correct? That's our trade deficit number, exports minus imports technically. Till last year, this number was widening and becoming close to around $200 billion. Now that's again a dangerous number, and that's precisely why we had the reaction to our currency what we had. We have tried to control it this year. This year the number is closer to $150 billion, but that still is a huge number, correct? So X minus M is consistently becoming bigger and bigger. So effectively this was a negative number, and the negative number became bigger and bigger, which means this has to go down again, correct? So in our equation, we see X minus M is falling. We see consumer spending is falling. We have kind of seen that gross fixed capital formation has not turned around. So that's another problem that's happening. This deficit of trade has actually improved this year, and as I said, in financial year 2014 we will be around $150 billion negative number, X minus M, but that's purely because we have basically banned gold imports completely. So we have banned this completely, and this ban is basically almost entirely the impact that we see from 200 to 150. So that is effectively the zeroed down impact of the banned gold imports. The moment you open it up, it will come back. And the moment it comes back, your X minus M will go down again, correct? So that's with X minus M. So this is kind of troublesome. Where is capacity utilization? So the RBI actually comes up with a small report. They don't really reveal how they arrive at these numbers. They give a very broad understanding that they surveyed about 1100 odd companies and looked at their capacity numbers. So if you look at the blue line, which is capacity utilization, overall capacity utilization, which used to hover around 79 odd percent, 75 to 79% in 2011-12, has now moved down to somewhere around 70 to 73%. If a company is operating at a 70% capacity, why will they put up more capex in this year? Unless they see a huge demand growth, which anecdotally is not happening, or they see a very good investment climate, which unfortunately at this point of time a country like ours is not giving, correct? So effectively, we don't see capacity utilization kind of coming up immediately. Now let's make sense of all these things. What we have seen is that in our equation, we have 4 data points. We see X minus M on a sustainable basis is increasing in the sense negative number is increasing. We have a negative number, so that's declining. That's making things bigger and bigger, correct? We see investment is degrowing or not growing at a great growth rate. We see consumption is actually declining. So auto sales, cement sales, all these data points are, or housing inventory data, or consumer durable sales, or mobile phone sales. If you pick up any kind of this data, this is all coming down dramatically, correct? Now, there are two news pieces which we have. So the first news piece is the one which is at the bottom of the paper, which is on Jan 24th. Our government, our finance minister, for example, comes and says that we can go back to 8% growth. Now, obviously, if we have to go back to 8% growth, this Y has to increase. Now, anecdotally speaking, we don't find any of the other three actually pointing out directly unless we see a sea change in the investment climate in the country. So the only other thing that must be propelling it must be government spending, correct? Then we come to another news item, which is around January once again, where our finance minister said in the budget speech that budget deficit will narrow to this thing and estimated 4.6% from the current fiscal year. Now, budget deficit is essentially how much the government is essentially spending minus what they are earning effectively, correct? So that's going to narrow down. So we were at roughly we spend about 5% of our GDP is our fiscal deficit, correct? So that much we spend more. This will only come down if the government stops spending, correct? So the government has to slow down its spending, which is what they are saying. They are trying to control this deficit at 4.1% from 4.6%. Current year number is going to be north of 5% in my opinion, but let's assume it is at an estimated 4.6% and they are trying to control it. The government is on the one hand saying that this G is going to get controlled, and on the other hand is saying that this Y will go up. Now, mathematically, that is a problem unless you see some data that improves any one of these three sustainably. And that's how you make sense of the statements that are given out. So practically, either your GDP will grow and your fiscal deficit will run out of hand, or your fiscal deficit will get controlled, which means government spending will get controlled, and we will see a couple of years of slow GDP growth. We are not seeing 8%, 9% again. One of these statements in isolation has to be untrue or has to be proven wrong over a period of time. Both these cannot be true simultaneously unless we find that consumption picks up dramatically. There is no real reason for that to happen because you don't see that around you. Or investment climate improves and companies start investing more. Now, why would they invest? They are operating at around 70% capacity utilization. So unless you operate at 100%, why would you invest more? That's part one. Part two, investment climate has to be great for them to do that. Part three is X minus M. This can improve, but this is improving artificially at this point of time, which means we have basically banned gold imports that is causing X minus M to improve. The moment we open it and let it go back to market forces, this will deteriorate significantly because I don't see that we have done something dramatically different in terms of improving our exports. Any which way, this is not a number that can change overnight. It's not like suddenly a country can develop export competitiveness. On balance, the currency would have helped us a little bit, but practically this data point, one of these two data points is going to be out of whack. There is something wrong in this, which we will see next year. But announcements can be made. So that's how you go and analyze just using this simple equation of what the GDP is, what the components of GDP are, how do you get that data. So all this data is available on various websites like RBI, websites like Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, MOSPI. You have a website called data.gov.in where you get this data. Almost every country will have their respective data points. This data would be available. And then you can try and make sense of this data based on individual data points. Fine. So that's broadly kind of the analysis that we wanted to do with individual components of GDP and understand whether it makes sense to understand what statements have been uttered or made in the media in the last few days. Correct? As we end, just some general observation at the end. This is again something that I have picked up from The Economist, and essentially if you look at this, this shows where we stood in terms of world GDP proportion. So if this is the last 2000 years of data, interesting chart, ad purchasing power parity. In the first year of, for 1 AD essentially, the dark maroon portion is essentially China, and this portion, peach portion, is India. We used to be the two biggest country in terms of GDP at the advent of AD. Till about the first millennium ending, we were still at the dominant position. Till close to about the year 1700, India and China were still dominant forces. That's when industrial revolution began, colonialism began, imperialism began. And, then India kind of slowed down considerably, China kind of slowed down considerably. The proportion of US, the proportion of Japan, the proportion of Germany, Britain, etc. increased over this period. Over a period of time, once again, China and India have started to assert ourselves. So essentially, that's just kind of a trivia point to understand that where these two countries started from and where are they headed over the next few years as we go along. So that broadly brings us to the end of this session.